The sun sets over a Roman suburb in the 1st century of the Common Era, and the city does not go to sleep. It transforms. The respectable world, the senators, the wealthy merchants, the powerful patrons and their eager clients, retreats behind the heavy oak doors of their sprawling domus. They also retreat behind the more modest but still secure entrances of their multi-story apartment blocks. The clatter of hooves and the murmur of serious business fade from the forum. The air, still warm from the day's sun, begins to cool, carrying with it the scent of dust settling on sun-baked stone. Something else takes its place in the streets, the taverns, the narrow, perpetually shadowed spaces between the towering insulae that never see full daylight, even at noon. This is not the Rome of gleaming marble columns and triumphal arches, perpetually whitewashed and grand. This is the Rome that the marble columns were built to make you forget, the city's underbelly emerging as twilight deepens. This is the Rome that smelled of open sewers, cheap wine, frying meat, and human desperation. As the last rays of light bled from the sky, painting the western horizon in hues of orange and purple, the initial chill of evening would settle. A dampness clung to the ancient stones. The air grew thick with the earthy scent of unpaved alleys, the pungent tang of fermented grapes from overflowing wine shops. The persistent, underlying odor of human waste permeated even the grandest districts. And it was, depending on your perspective, either the most exciting or the most repulsive place in the ancient world. Let us walk into it together. Let us see exactly what happened after dark in the suburbs of Rome. These were the places called the suburbium, the areas just beyond the city walls. Here, the rules were looser, the surveillance thinner, and the night considerably longer than it was in the respectable center of the empire. Here, the boundaries of class and propriety blurred under the cloak of darkness. This is the Rome that lived after dark. And once you see it, the city you thought you knew vanishes. The first thing you notice is the noise. Roman cities were extraordinarily loud during the day, a constant din of commerce, construction, and conversation, a cacophony of human and animal life that pressed in from all sides. Julius Caesar himself, when he governed Rome in the 1st century before the Common Era, was so acutely aware of this incessant clamor that he issued an edict. This edict was recorded by the historian Suetonius in his Divus Julius. It banned wheeled vehicles from the city center during daylight hours. The incessant racket of cart wheels on stone was causing civic chaos and disrupting public order. Those carts, laden with everything from building materials to foodstuffs, banned during the day, ran at night instead. As dusk settled, the grinding sound of iron-rimmed wheels on stone paving began, a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated through the very ground. This was accompanied by the harsh shouts of drivers urging their oxen or mules forward, the lowing and braying of animals. The sharp crack of whips echoed off tall buildings, and the general din of a city resupplying itself in darkness. It was a constant, industrial auditory backdrop to everything else that happened after sunset, a relentless rhythm of labor and logistics. This wasn't a minor quirk of urban life. Indeed, it was the fundamental, inescapable pulse of a major imperial city, a testament to its ceaseless metabolism. But layered over that industrial noise was something more human and considerably more unsettling. The Roman night was the territory of people who had no place in the daylight order, those pushed to the margins by the city's rigid social structures. Freed slaves navigated a world that had given them legal status but almost no economic safety. They often struggled to find work beyond menial tasks or relied on precarious patronage, their freedom a fragile thing. Immigrants from across the empire, Syrians, Egyptians, Gauls, Greeks, crowded into the cheapest, most dilapidated housing the suburbium offered. Their diverse languages and customs added to the melting pot of the night. Criminals, from petty thieves to more organized gangs, operated with a confidence that the city's vigiles, a combined fire brigade and night watch, could not reliably suppress. The streets after dark in a Roman suburb were not dangerous in the cinematic sense of dramatic, sword-wielding confrontation. Instead, they were dangerous in the more grinding, more realistic sense of a place where things could go wrong in quiet ways. For example, a purse snatched, a dark alley ambush, or a sudden fall in unlit streets. These incidents left almost no trace, swallowed by the morning light. The very word vigiles comes from the Latin vigil, meaning awake or watchful, implying a constant vigilance. Yet, despite this etymological promise, their practical effectiveness in maintaining order against the tide of nocturnal activity was severely limited. The vigiles, for all their official authority and the watchful nature implied by their name, numbered roughly 7,000 men for the entire city of Rome. This was a sprawling metropolis with a population that could reach perhaps 1 million people. Established by Emperor Augustus in 6 AD, their primary concern was fire. This was a threat of existential proportions in a city of densely packed wooden apartment buildings and narrow streets. They were equipped with buckets, axes, and ladders, and their primary duty was to prevent and extinguish the frequent infernos that ravaged Rome. Petty crime, assault, and the various transactions of the night economy were largely their own affair, often overlooked in the more pressing battle against fire. This was not chaos in the sense of anarchy. This was simply how the city functioned when the sun went down, a tacit acceptance of a parallel nocturnal order. The air was thick with the earthy smell of damp soil, the sharp, acrid tang of human waste from overflowing cesspits. There was also the distant, ever-present scent of wood smoke from countless cooking fires and hearths. And the darkness was almost complete, broken only by the flickering glow of a rare oil lamp or the occasional, fleeting light of a torch, making every step an act of faith. The limited resources and specific mandate of the vigiles highlight a crucial implication. The Roman state prioritized the protection of property from fire over the personal safety of its poorer citizens from crime. The Roman tavern, the thermopolium, was the central institution of nightlife in any suburb, and the ones that operated after dark were a different animal entirely from their daytime equivalents. What Gladiator or I, Claudius shows you are often clean, orderly places, filled with respectable citizens sipping wine. That's not what this looked like. Archaeologists excavating Pompeii, a city frozen in time by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, have identified well over 80 thermopolia in a city of perhaps 11,000 people. Many of these had distinctive L-shaped counters, built-in dolia, and even wall paintings advertising their wares. Think about what that density means: one thermopolium for every 130 to 140 inhabitants. This gives you some sense of how central communal eating and drinking were to Roman social life, especially for those without private kitchens. But the nighttime thermopolium served more than food and wine. They were gambling dens, the clatter of dice on wooden tables a constant backdrop to hushed conversations. They were meeting places for collegia, the semi-legal associations of tradesmen, freedmen, and immigrants. These functioned somewhere between a trade union, a social club, and a protection network. The air inside these establishments was thick, heavy with the smell of stale wine, roasted meat, garlic, and unwashed bodies. It was illuminated by the dim, smoky light of sputtering oil lamps. The floors were often grimy, sticky with spilled drinks, and the wooden tables bore the marks of countless nights of revelry and negotiation. These were places where information was traded, where debts were settled, and where work was arranged. They were also where the kind of agreements that could not be made in daylight found their natural environment. The Roman authorities regarded the collegia with deep suspicion precisely because they organized exactly the class of people: the poor, the mobile, the unattached, and the socially marginalized. This was the class that the Roman social order most feared as a political force. Emperors like Trajan, for instance, were known to be particularly wary of collegia, restricting their formation and activities. They feared their potential for sedition or riot, as documented by Pliny the Younger in his correspondence. The wine served in these establishments deserves its own moment of attention because it was nothing like what the word wine suggests to a modern ear. Roman wine was almost always cut with water, often in ratios of 1 part wine to 3 or more parts water. Drinking it undiluted was considered a mark of barbarity or desperate drunkenness, a practice typically associated with uncivilized peoples. And even the diluted version was frequently supplemented with additives. These ranged from the merely unusual to the genuinely alarming, reflecting both preservation needs and a taste for strong, often artificial, flavors. Seawater was commonly added as a preservative, lending a distinctive briny tang to the drink. Lead acetate, a potent neurotoxin, was extracted by boiling grape must in lead vessels to create a sweet syrup called sapa or defrutum. It was used as a sweetener so commonly that modern researchers, such as Jerome Nriagu in his work on lead poisoning in ancient Rome, have theorized chronic lead poisoning may have been widespread among Roman wine drinkers. This could lead to symptoms like gout, abdominal pain, and neurological damage. Raisins, herbs like thyme and rosemary, spices such as pepper and myrrh, and honey were standard additions, masking the often poor quality of the base wine. Cheaper taverns sometimes extended their product with substances that defied easy categorization, further obscuring the true nature of the drink. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder died investigating the eruption of Vesuvius and left behind a natural history of extraordinary scope. He catalogued wine adulterants with the weary thoroughness of someone who had seen too much in Book 14 of his natural history. Drinking in a cheap Roman tavern at night was an act of chemical adventure as much as a social one, a gamble with one's health for the sake of cheap pleasure and camaraderie. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale wine, roasted meat, and unwashed bodies, creating a pungent, overwhelming atmosphere. So where did the night take these people next? And then there were the prostitutes, and this is where the Roman suburban night becomes most revealing about the fault lines of Roman society. Prostitution in Rome was legal, taxed, and socially stratified to a degree that reflects the Roman talent for organizing everything into hierarchies. At the top were the courtesans, known as meretrices. These were educated, expensive, sometimes extraordinarily influential women. They operated in the world of the wealthy and powerful, often acting as companions at dinner parties and cultural events. They bore little resemblance to the street-level reality of those at the bottom, the women and men who worked the streets and the cheaper brothels of the suburbium. Their lives were documented not in flattering literary accounts but in the stark reality of graffiti, the dry language of legal records, and the archaeological evidence of the buildings they worked in. Pompeii's Lupanary, the city's largest known brothel, contained small stone cells barely large enough for a cot. Explicit paintings above each door advertised the services within, a crude menu for potential clients. The air in these confined spaces would have been heavy with the smell of sweat, cheap perfume, and stale incense, the rough stone walls offering no comfort. The women who worked there were overwhelmingly slaves or freed slaves with no other economic option, operating within a system that gave them legal protection from exactly nothing. The Roman legal framework around prostitution was a master class in the kind of double standard that runs through Roman social history like a crack through marble. Prostitution was legal and socially tolerated for men who purchased it, seen as a legitimate outlet for male sexual desire. But the women who provided it were classified as infames, formally stripped of the legal protections and social standing that freeborn Roman citizens held. They could not marry Roman citizens, could not give testimony in court. They occupied a legal category roughly equivalent to gladiators and actors. These were people whose bodies were available for public entertainment and who paid for that availability with their standing as persons before the law. The word infamous comes from Latin, meaning, without good repute, or disgraced. It literally meant a loss of social honor. It was a public declaration that one's word and person carried no weight in the eyes of the law and society, as stipulated by laws like the Lex Julia de Adulteriis Coercendis of Augustus. Think about what that tells us about how Roman society understood the people who serviced its desires, necessary, but utterly contemptible. The streets themselves after midnight in the Roman suburbium were a landscape of sharp contrasts. Wealthy Romans moving between dinner parties or social engagements traveled in enclosed litters carried by 2 to 8 slaves. They were surrounded by torch-bearing attendants who served simultaneously as light sources and informal security, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. The poor, however, moved on foot in absolute darkness, navigating narrow, unpaved streets that had no public lighting whatsoever. These streets were also shared with the waste that householders emptied from upper windows throughout the night. Roman satirist Juvenal, writing in the early 2nd century AD in his satires, described the experience of walking Rome's streets at night. He did so with a venom that still reads as visceral across 2,000 years. He catalogued the dangers with black humor and bitter realism, the sudden splash of chamber pots emptied from above, the risk of being struck by falling roof tiles, the drunken brawlers who blocked narrow alleys. The apartment buildings themselves, the insulae, were the defining architectural feature of the Roman suburb, and they were among the most dangerous structures in the ancient world. Built to 6 or 7 stories in some cases, constructed from a combination of stone, brick, and wood, and packed with tenants who cooked over open flames in rooms with no chimneys, they burned with a regularity that the historian Livy recorded with exhausted familiarity. The wealthiest tenants occupied the lower floors, closer to the street, closer to escape. The poorest crammed into the upper stories, the ones hardest to reach when fire broke out below. The ones where the smoke arrived first. On any given night in a Roman suburb, somewhere in those stacked towers of human habitation, someone was already in trouble. And the vigiles were probably dealing with something else entirely. And yet, here is the detail that most popular accounts of Roman nightlife miss entirely in their eagerness to focus on the squalor and the vice. The Roman night was also a space of genuine, defiant cultural vitality. Street performers worked the spaces between the taverns, acrobats drawing crowds, musicians playing the lyre and aulos until well past midnight. Storytellers held audiences wrapped in firelight. Astrologers and dream interpreters set up near temple precincts, offering their services to people who worked 12-hour days and found in the night's entertainment the only leisure their lives afforded. The Roman poor were not passive victims of their environment. They built communities, celebrated festivals, maintained religious practices centered on household gods and neighborhood shrines, and created a social world of considerable richness within the constraints of extraordinary poverty. The graffiti of Pompeii is full of jokes, declarations of love, political insults, and the kind of petty boasting that suggests people engaged with their world rather than crushed by it. What the Roman suburban night reveals, ultimately, is not simply a portrait of ancient depravity. It is a portrait of what happens to the bottom of any hierarchical society after the top goes to bed. The transactions that cannot be conducted in daylight. The freedoms that only exist in darkness. The communities that form precisely because they have been excluded from the respectable world. And the human insistence on finding pleasure, connection, and meaning even in the least promising circumstances that history has to offer. The torches guttered in the alleyways. The wine was bad and the beds were worse. And in the narrow streets between the insulae, 10,000 people who history mostly forgot went about the business of being alive. As loudly, as messily, and as defiantly human as any person you have ever known. Subscribe, like, and comment your favorite Roman nightlife fact below. What actually happened inside the walls of the imperial palace after dark? That story is coming next. If you found this fascinating, hit subscribe and the notification bell so you never miss a video. And tell me, what would you have done on a night out in ancient Rome? Drop your answer in the comments below. The next video reveals what really happened behind the closed doors of the imperial palace.